I sold my house to pay for my surgery. I asked my daughter for a room. She said, "Dad, my husband says you are a burden." That night, I slept in a shelter. The next morning, a black Cadillac Escalade stopped in front of the shelter. A man in a suit grabbed my wrist, looked dead in the eye, and said, "I finally found you. There is someone you need to meet." A dying billionaire refused to sign his will without seeing me. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought the words, "You are a burden," could cut deeper than a surgeon's scalpel, but my daughter Tara proved me wrong. At 63 years old, lying in a hospital bed with fresh stitches across my chest, I learned that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most can inflict wounds that never heal. The morning light filtered through the sterile windows of Mercy General Hospital, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. I had been awake since 5, watching the clock tick toward my discharge time. The bypass surgery had gone well, the doctors assured me, but I still felt fragile, like a piece of glass that might shatter at any sudden movement. My chest ached with each breath, and the medication made everything feel distant and hazy. Tara arrived at exactly 9 o'clock, just as she had promised. I could hear her heels clicking against the hospital floor long before she appeared in my doorway. She looked immaculate, as always, her blonde hair perfectly styled, wearing a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months. But there was something cold in her blue eyes, something that made my stomach clench with unease. "Hi, Dad," she said, setting her designer purse down on the visitor's chair. Her voice was bright, but it felt forced, like she was performing rather than speaking. "Ready to get out of here?" I nodded, trying to sit up straighter despite the pulling sensation in my chest. "More than ready. This place makes me nervous." She helped me gather my few belongings, the worn leather wallet that held the only photo I had of her mother, the reading glasses with the cracked frame I couldn't afford to replace, and the small bag of clothes I'd brought for my 3-day stay. Everything I owned seemed to fit in one plastic hospital bag, and the sight of it made me feel smaller somehow. The ride to her house was uncomfortably quiet. I stared out the passenger window at the suburban landscape, noting how different this part of town was from my small apartment complex. Tara lived in Meadowbrook Estates, where the houses were large and the lawns were perfectly manicured. Her home was a 2-story colonial with beige siding and black shutters, identical to every other house on the block except for the expensive cars in the driveways. "Kevin's working from home today," she mentioned as we pulled into her driveway, and something in her tone made me glance at her. There was tension around her eyes, the kind I remembered from when she was a teenager trying to avoid getting in trouble. Kevin Walsh, my son-in-law of 13 years, had never warmed up to me. He was a successful insurance broker who seemed to measure everything in terms of profit and loss, including relationships. I had always been a loss in his ledger. He tolerated me at family gatherings and remembered to ask about my health when Tara prompted him, but I could see the calculation behind his polite smile. When we walked through the front door, the house felt cold, despite the expensive heating system. The living room was decorated in neutral tones, everything matching and coordinated, but there was no warmth to it. It looked like a magazine photo rather than a home where people actually lived. "Kevin!" Tara called out, her voice echoing through the high ceilings. "Dad's here!" He emerged from his home office wearing khakis and a polo shirt, his brown hair styled with gel even though he wasn't leaving the house. When he saw me, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Alan," he said with a nod that wasn't quite a greeting. "How are you feeling?" "Better each day," I replied, though standing in their entryway with my plastic hospital bag made me feel anything but better. "Thank you for letting me stay here while I recover. It means everything to me." The silence that followed stretched too long. Kevin and Tara exchanged a look that I recognized but didn't want to interpret. It was the same look they'd shared at Christmas when I'd asked if I could help with anything, the same look when I'd offered to pay for dinner at restaurants that cost more than my monthly Social Security check. "Dad," Tara said, and her voice had changed. The forced brightness was gone, replaced by something apologetic, but firm. "We need to talk." She gestured toward the living room, and I followed her on unsteady legs. Kevin remained standing while Tara and I sat on opposite ends of the beige sectional sofa. The cushions were too soft, making it hard to find a comfortable position with my healing incision. "The thing is," Tara began, looking at her manicured hands rather than at me, "this recovery is going to take 6 to 8 weeks, right? That's what the doctor said?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. Something was happening here, something I didn't want to understand. "And you'll need help with medications, getting to follow-up appointments, basic things around the house," she continued. Her words sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced this conversation. "I won't be much trouble," I said quickly. "I can take care of myself mostly. I just need somewhere to stay while I get back on my feet." Kevin cleared his throat, and when I looked up at him, his expression was harder than I'd ever seen it. "Alan, that's the problem. You can't take care of yourself. Not right now, and we can't take care of you either." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my chest tighten, and for a moment I couldn't tell if it was emotional pain or something wrong with my heart. "What Kevin means," Tara said, shooting him a warning look, "is that we're not equipped for this. We both work full-time, we have our own responsibilities. Taking care of someone who just had major surgery, it's just too much." I stared at my daughter, this woman I'd raised alone after her mother died when she was 7. I remembered nights when she had nightmares and climbed into my bed, how I'd held her until she fell back asleep. I remembered working double shifts at the construction company to pay for her dance lessons, her school clothes, her college tuition. I remembered being so proud when she graduated, when she got married, when she bought this beautiful house. "I sold my house to pay for the surgery," I said quietly. "You know that. I have nowhere else to go." Tara's face flushed pink. "That was your choice, Dad. We told you we could help with the medical bills, but you insisted on handling it yourself." That was true. I had refused their offer of a loan because I knew Kevin resented every dollar they spent on me, and I couldn't bear to be more of a burden than I already was. The irony wasn't lost on me now. "Besides," Kevin added, his voice getting louder, "you're not our responsibility. You're a grown man. Figure it out." "Kevin!" Tara snapped, but the damage was done. I looked at my son-in-law, this man who lived in a house worth $400,000, who drove a car that cost more than I'd ever made in a year, who wouldn't let his wife's father stay in one of his 4 bedrooms for a few weeks. "I see," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, it's not personal," Tara said, and she actually seemed to believe that. "It's just complicated. Kevin's mother might come visit next month, and we're renovating the guest bathroom, and with our schedules—" I held up my hand to stop her. I didn't want to hear the excuses, the careful justifications she'd constructed to make this acceptable to herself. I understood perfectly. I was 63 years old, recently widowed for the 2nd time, with no family except the daughter sitting across from me, who was explaining why I couldn't stay in her home. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked. Kevin shrugged. "There are places, senior communities, extended stay hotels, maybe your insurance covers some kind of rehabilitation facility." With what money, I wanted to ask, but I didn't. I had exactly $3,047 left in my checking account after paying for the surgery. My monthly Social Security was $812. Kevin knew this, they both knew this. "Maybe Aunt Ruth could help," Tara suggested weakly, referring to my deceased wife's sister who lived in Florida and hadn't spoken to me in 5 years. I stood up slowly, my chest aching with the effort. "I'll figure something out." "Dad, don't be like this," Tara said, but she didn't get up. She didn't offer alternatives. She didn't change her mind. I picked up my plastic hospital bag and walked toward the door. Each step felt like walking underwater, everything slow and surreal. "Alan," Kevin called after me, and when I turned back he was standing with his arms crossed. "You need to understand something. You are a burden. That's just the truth. We can't sacrifice our lives to take care of yours." The words echoed in the silence that followed. Tara gasped and said his name in shock, but she didn't contradict him. She didn't defend me. She didn't tell him he was wrong. I nodded once, opened the front door, and walked out into the October afternoon. Behind me, I could hear them arguing in low, urgent voices, but I didn't look back. By evening, I was sitting on a cot in the downtown homeless shelter, staring at the cracked concrete walls and listening to the sounds of desperation echoing around me. The smell of disinfectant couldn't quite mask the odors of unwashed bodies and institutional food. Men coughed and shuffled in the darkness, and somewhere nearby someone was crying. I lay down carefully, protecting my healing chest, and stared at the water-stained ceiling. For the first time in my life, I was completely alone. No wife, no family, no home. At 63 years old, I had become exactly what Kevin said I was, a burden that nobody wanted to carry. The worst part wasn't the shelter or the fear or even the physical discomfort. The worst part was that my own daughter had looked me in the eye and chosen her husband's comfort over her father's survival. And I couldn't stop loving her anyway. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow I would have to figure out how to rebuild a life I thought was already built. But tonight I just had to survive the weight of learning that blood doesn't always mean family and family doesn't always mean love. The fluorescent lights never fully dimmed in the shelter, and in their harsh glow I finally understood what it meant to be truly abandoned. The downtown Mercy shelter became my world for the next 5 days, though it felt like a lifetime trapped in someone else's nightmare. Each morning I woke to the sound of shuffling feet and whispered conversations as men prepared to face another day of searching for work, for help, for some small piece of dignity in a world that had forgotten them. I had become one of them now, and the realization settled in my chest like a weight that made breathing even harder than the surgery had. My cot was number 47, squeezed between an elderly man named Frank, who talked to himself about his grandson who never visited, and a younger guy called Tommy who'd lost his job at the factory when they moved operations overseas. The thin mattress offered little comfort against my healing incision, and every night I had to position myself carefully to avoid putting pressure on my chest. Sister Mary Catherine ran the shelter with the kind of fierce compassion that only comes from someone who'd seen too much suffering to waste time on pleasantries. She was a small woman in her late 60s, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul. On my second day, she approached my cot while I was struggling to get my medications organized. "You're the heart surgery fellow," she said, not really a question. Her voice carried the slight accent of someone who'd grown up somewhere far from here. "How are you managing the pain?" I looked up at her, surprised by the directness of her concern. "I'm managing." She studied me for a moment, then sat down on the folding chair next to my cot. "That's what they all say. The ones who aren't used to asking for help." She nodded toward my plastic bag of belongings. "You don't look like someone who planned to be here." I almost smiled at that. "No, I don't suppose I do." "What happened?" Something about her manner made it easy to talk. Maybe it was the way she asked without judgment, or maybe it was just the relief of having someone actually interested in my answer. So I told her about the surgery, about selling my small house to pay for it, about Tara and Kevin and the words that had cut deeper than any scalpel. Sister Mary Catherine listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, her expression never changing. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "How long since your wife passed?" she asked finally. "Susan died 3 years ago. Cancer." The words still felt foreign in my mouth. "Before that, it was Tara's mother, Linda. Heart attack when Tara was 7. I raised Tara alone after that." "And you did construction work?" I nodded. 41 years with Morrison Construction. Not related, just coincidence with the name. Started as a laborer when I was 18, worked my way up to foreman. Retired 2 years ago when my arthritis got too bad for the heavy work. She asked about my life, with a gentle persistence that drew out details I hadn't thought about in years. How I'd worked double shifts to afford Tara's dance lessons, the way I'd sit up all night when she had the flu, checking her temperature every hour. How proud I'd been when she graduated from college, the first in our family to get a degree. "She was everything to me after Linda died," I said, staring at the concrete floor. "I probably spoiled her. I wanted to give her everything I never had." "And what did you never have?" The question caught me off guard. I had to think about it. Security, I guess. My parents died when I was young, car accident. I grew up with my Aunt Margaret, but she was old and tired. She did her best, but I always felt like I was taking up space in someone else's life. Sister Mary Catherine made a small sound of understanding. And you were determined your daughter would never feel that way. Exactly. I pulled out my worn wallet and showed her the photo I always carried. Linda and me on our wedding day, both of us so young and hopeful. I wanted Tara to always know she belonged somewhere. But she never learned to belong to anyone else. The observation hit me like a physical blow because it was so obviously true. I had given Tara everything, asked for nothing in return, and somehow created a person who couldn't imagine giving anything to anyone else. The irony, Sister Mary Catherine said gently, is that you taught her to take care of herself so well that she never learned to take care of others. That night, I lay awake thinking about her words. Around me, the shelter settled into its uneasy rhythm of restless sleep, broken dreams, and the kind of exhaustion that goes bone deep. Frank muttered about his grandson again. Tommy coughed the deep, wet cough of someone who'd been breathing factory chemicals for too many years. I thought about the house I'd sold, a modest two-bedroom ranch in a working-class neighborhood where I'd lived for 22 years. It had been small but mine, with a garden where Linda used to grow tomatoes and a garage where I'd taught Tara to change a tire. I'd painted every room myself, fixed every leak, replaced every broken board. When I signed the papers to sell it, the realtor had looked at me with pity. "You sure about this, Mr. Morrison? There are other options for medical financing." But I'd been sure. The house was worth $87,000 after I paid off the remaining mortgage. The surgery and hospital stay cost $79,500. It had seemed like a straightforward equation at the time. Now, lying in the shelter, I realized I'd given up more than just a building. I'd given up the last physical proof that my life had mattered, that I'd built something lasting. The shelter was proof that I'd failed to build anything at all. During the days I tried to stay useful. I helped in the kitchen, sweeping floors and wiping down tables, though the work tired me more than it should have. The other residents were kind in the way that people who understand suffering can be. They shared their stories carefully, like precious things that might break if handled too roughly. Marcus had been an accountant until diabetes took his leg and his job. He spent his days at the library, reading financial newspapers and muttering about opportunities he could see but no longer access. "I used to manage million-dollar budgets," he told me one afternoon. "Now I can't manage a bus fare." Robert was a veteran who'd never quite made it home from Vietnam, though his body had returned decades ago. He had nightmares that woke half the shelter, and during the day he sat quietly in the corner, reading paperback novels with covers so worn you couldn't make out the titles. They all had stories of families who'd slowly pulled away, friends who'd stopped calling, a gradual erosion of connection until they found themselves here, in this place that smelled of industrial soap and broken dreams. "The thing about becoming invisible," Frank said to me on my 4th day, "is that it happens so slow you don't notice until you try to wave at someone and realize they can't see you anymore." He was right. I'd been becoming invisible for years. After Linda died, then Susan, then retirement, then the health problems, my world had been shrinking steadily. I'd told myself I was being strong, independent, not wanting to be a burden. But really, I'd been disappearing. On my 5th morning in the shelter, I sat in the small chapel area where Sister Mary Catherine held optional services. I wasn't particularly religious, but the quiet felt healing in a way that the medicine couldn't touch. She spoke about value and worth, about how society teaches us to measure people by what they produce rather than who they are. "Every person here has loved someone," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the sparse room. "Every person here has worked, has dreamed, has mattered to someone somewhere. That doesn't change because your circumstances change." After the service, she approached me again. "You're healing well," she observed, watching how I moved. "The chest, yes, the rest of it." I shrugged. "The rest of it will heal too, but differently than you expect." I didn't know what she meant then. I was still focused on my immediate problems. Where I would go when I was strong enough to leave the shelter, how I would afford an apartment, whether I could find some kind of part-time work that wouldn't aggravate my condition. But that afternoon, everything changed. I was sitting outside on one of the benches in the shelter's small courtyard, watching the traffic pass by on the street beyond the chain-link fence. The October sun felt good on my face, and for the first time since the surgery, I was breathing easily. Men came and went around me, some heading to job interviews or doctor's appointments, others just wandering with no particular destination. That's when I saw it. A black Cadillac Escalade with tinted windows moving slowly down the street like it was searching for something. It passed the shelter once, then circled back and stopped directly in front of the main entrance. The driver's door opened and a man in an expensive gray suit stepped out. He was maybe 45, with dark hair and the kind of confident posture that comes from never having to worry about money. He looked completely out of place in this neighborhood of pawn shops and check-cashing stores. He stood there for a moment, studying the building, then walked through the gate and approached the main desk inside. Through the window, I could see him talking to Sister Mary Catherine, showing her something that might have been a photograph. A few minutes later, they both came outside. The man's eyes scanned the courtyard methodically, and when they landed on me, they stopped. He said something to Sister Mary Catherine, who nodded and pointed in my direction. My heart started beating faster, though I couldn't say why. There was something about the deliberate way he moved, the expensive car, the fact that he was clearly looking for someone specific, that made my chest tighten with a combination of fear and anticipation. He walked across the courtyard toward me, his leather shoes clicking on the concrete. When he stopped in front of my bench, he smiled, but it was a professional smile, the kind lawyers and salesmen practice in mirrors. "Alan Morrison?" he asked. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather portfolio. "My name is James Richardson. I'm an attorney." He paused, studying my face intently. "I've been looking for you for a very long time." The words hung in the air between us, loaded with possibilities I couldn't begin to imagine. Around us, the normal sounds of the shelter continued, but everything felt suddenly unreal, like I was watching someone else's life from a great distance. "Looking for me?" I managed to say. "Why?" James Richardson's smile became more genuine, though there was something almost sad about it. "Because someone very important needs to see you before it's too late. Someone who's been searching for you her entire life." He extended his hand toward me, palm up, like an invitation. "Will you come with me, Mr. Morrison? There's someone you need to meet." I stared at his outstretched hand, my mind racing. After 5 days of being invisible, someone had found me. After 63 years of being ordinary, someone was searching for me. After a lifetime of being exactly what Kevin called me, a burden, someone needed to see me. The black Cadillac waited at the curb, its engine running quietly like a promise of answers to questions I'd never known to ask. The black Cadillac moved through the city like it owned the streets, its leather interior so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. James Richardson sat beside me in the back seat, occasionally glancing at his phone, but mostly he just watched me with the kind of careful attention that made me wonder if I was supposed to disappear at any moment, like this was all an elaborate mistake. I pressed my hand against my chest, feeling the ridge of the healing scar beneath my shirt. The pain medication made everything feel slightly unreal, but the expensive car, the suited lawyer, the mysterious urgency of it all, none of it felt like the kind of hallucination that comes from prescription drugs. "Where are we going?" I asked as we turned into a part of the city I'd never seen before, where the buildings were taller and the streets were lined with trees that someone actually maintained. "Whitmore Medical Center," James said. "It's a private hospital, the best cardiac care in the state." I knew the name. Even construction workers heard about places like Whitmore Medical, the kind of hospital where movie stars and politicians went when they needed surgery, the kind of place that cost more per day than I used to make in a month. "Why are we going there?" James hesitated, then pulled out a manila folder from his briefcase. "There's someone who's been looking for you, Alan. Someone who's spent more money than you can imagine trying to find you. She's very sick, and she refuses to sign her will until she meets you." "I think you have the wrong person," I said. "I don't know anyone with that kind of money. I'm nobody special." He opened the folder and handed me a photograph. It was old, probably from the 1960s, showing a young woman with dark hair and eyes that looked familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. She was holding a baby, maybe a few months old, and her smile was radiant despite the tears on her cheeks. "Do you recognize her?" I studied the photo, feeling like I should know something I didn't. The woman was beautiful, but more than that, there was something about her expression that reminded me of this baby, I said, pointing to the infant in her arms. "How old is this picture?" 1960. The baby was born on March 15th. My birthday. I felt the world tilt slightly. "James, I need you to tell me what's going on." He took the photograph back, handling it like something precious. "The woman in that picture is Margaret Whitmore. She's 89 years old now, and she's dying. The baby is her grandson." "Her grandson?" "You, Alan. That baby is you." The words hit me like a physical force. I sank back into the leather seat, my mind struggling to process what he'd said. "That's impossible. I was raised by my aunt. My parents died in a car accident when I was young." "Your Aunt Margaret Morrison wasn't really your aunt," James said gently. "She was a kind woman who agreed to raise you when the real Margaret Whitmore, was forced to give you up." The car stopped at a red light, and in the silence I could hear the sound of my own breathing, fast and shallow. "Forced to give me up." It's complicated, and it's not my story to tell. But Margaret Whitmore has been searching for you for 63 years. She hired private investigators, genealogists, DNA specialists. When your medical records showed up in the Whitmore Medical Center database after your surgery, one of her people flagged it. Your birth date, your blood type, certain markers, they all matched what she'd been looking for. I stared out the window at the city passing by, everything looking different now, like I was seeing it through someone else's eyes. Why didn't she keep me? That's something you'll have to ask her yourself. The Whitmore Medical Center occupied an entire city block, its glass and granite facade rising 15 stories into the October sky. The lobby looked more like a luxury hotel than a hospital, with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and fresh flower arrangements that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. James led me to a private elevator that required a special key card. We rode to the 14th floor in silence, and when the doors opened, I stepped into what felt like another world. The hallway was carpeted in deep burgundy, lined with original paintings and furnished with antique chairs that looked like they belonged in a museum. "The entire floor is private suites," James explained as we walked. "Margaret has been here for 3 weeks. Her condition is stable, but she's choosing not to pursue further treatment. She's giving up. She's 99 years old, Alan. She's lived longer than anyone expected, but she says she can't rest until she meets you." We stopped in front of a door marked Suite 14A. James knocked softly, then opened it without waiting for an answer. The room beyond was unlike any hospital room I'd ever seen. Tall windows overlooked the city, heavy curtains filtered the afternoon light, and the furniture looked like it had been moved from someone's home rather than purchased from a medical supply company. The smell wasn't antiseptic and medicinal, it was subtle perfume and fresh flowers. An elderly woman sat in a wheelchair by the window, her silver hair perfectly styled despite her obvious frailty. She wore a navy blue dress with a pearl necklace, and when she turned to look at us, her eyes were the same dark brown I saw in the mirror every morning. "Margaret," James said softly, "I found him." She stared at me for a long moment, her hands gripping the arms of her wheelchair. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Oh, my God. You look just like your grandfather." I stood frozen in the doorway, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This woman, this stranger, was looking at me like I was the answer to every prayer she'd ever said. "I don't understand," I managed to say. Margaret Whitmore smiled, and despite her age and illness, her face transformed. "Come sit with me, Alan, please. I have so much to tell you." James helped her wheel the chair closer to a comfortable armchair, and I sat down carefully, my chest still tender from the surgery. Up close, I could see how thin she was, how the expensive dress hung loose on her frame, but her eyes were bright and alert. 63 years, she said, reaching out to touch my hand. Her skin was soft and cool, marked with age spots and prominent veins, but her grip was surprisingly strong. I've been looking for you for 63 years. James said you're my grandmother, but I don't understand how that's possible. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Your mother was my daughter, Sarah Whitmore. She died giving birth to you. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. I had always been told that my mother died when I was very young, but the woman who raised me, the woman I called Aunt Margaret, had never given me details. She'd said it was too painful to talk about. I was 26 when Sarah was born, Margaret continued. My husband, Robert, and I had tried for years to have children. Sarah was our miracle baby, our everything. She was brilliant and beautiful and stubborn as a mule. She smiled at the memory, but the tears continued to fall. When she was 17, she fell in love with a boy named David Morrison. He was a good boy, worked construction to support his family after his father died. But my husband, my first husband, Charles, he had different ideas about who Sarah should marry. Someone with money, with connections, someone who could benefit the family business. I felt a chill run down my spine. What happened? Charles forbade the relationship. He sent Sarah away to a boarding school in Switzerland, told everyone she was studying abroad, but she was pregnant with you. Margaret paused, her breathing becoming labored. James moved to get her some water, but she waved him away. She wrote me letters from Switzerland, begging me to help her come home, to let her marry David. But Charles controlled everything, the money, the decisions, my life. I was a coward, Alan. I let him send her away, and I let him arrange for you to be adopted as soon as you were born. But she died, I said, my voice hoarse. Complications during delivery. She was all alone in that foreign hospital, surrounded by strangers who didn't even speak her language properly. My daughter died calling for her mother, and I wasn't there because I was too weak to stand up to my husband. The room fell silent except for the soft sound of Margaret's crying. I sat there holding the hand of this woman who was my grandmother, feeling like my entire life had been rewritten in the span of 10 minutes. Why didn't you find me sooner? I asked. Margaret wiped her eyes with a lace handkerchief that looked like it had been crying into for decades. Charles destroyed all the adoption records. He said it was better if you disappeared completely, that the family couldn't afford any scandals. After he died in 1972, I started looking, but the trail was cold. The adoption agency had closed, the Swiss hospital had destroyed their old records, and your adoptive family had moved several times. Aunt Margaret, the woman who raised me, she never told me any of this. Margaret Morrison was a saint, the real Margaret said firmly. She and her husband couldn't have children of their own. When Charles's lawyers approached them about a private adoption, she opened her heart and her home to you. She promised to tell you the truth when you were older, but then her husband died, and she was struggling to raise you alone. She thought it might be easier if you believed she was your real family. I thought about the woman who had raised me, how she'd always seemed sad around my birthday, how she'd never been able to answer my questions about my parents without changing the subject. She loved you, Margaret continued. The adoption agency required annual reports for the first few years. I still have copies. She wrote about your first steps, your first words, how proud she was when you started school. She sent photographs until you were about 8 years old. You have photographs of me as a child? Margaret's smile was radiant. I have photographs, report cards, every letter she sent until Charles found out and made her stop. I have birthday presents I bought for you every year, Christmas gifts, graduation gifts. I have a whole room in my house that's been waiting for you since 1960. The magnitude of what she was saying slowly sank in. This woman had been buying me presents for 63 years. She had kept a room for me, had never stopped hoping that someday she would find me. Margaret, James said gently, you should tell him about the will. She nodded, her expression becoming more serious. "Alan, I'm dying. The doctors say I have maybe weeks, possibly a month if I'm lucky. I've spent my entire adult life building a business empire, accumulating wealth, but none of it has meant anything because I didn't have family to share it with. I don't understand. Whitmore Enterprises is worth over $400 million. Real estate, investments, charitable foundations. When I die, it all goes to you." I felt like I couldn't breathe. "That's impossible. You don't even know me." "I've known you your entire life," Margaret said firmly. "I've watched from a distance, hired people to check on you to make sure you were safe and happy. I know you worked construction for 41 years and never missed a day unless you were sick. I know you raised your daughter alone after your wife died. I know you sold your house to pay for your surgery because you were too proud to accept charity. I know you're a good man, Alan, because you're Sarah's son." She leaned forward in her wheelchair, her dark eyes intense. "More importantly, I know what it's like to lose family, to spend your life wondering what if. I won't let that happen to you. You deserve to know where you came from, and you deserve to have the security that was stolen from you when Charles sent Sarah away." I sat back in the chair, overwhelmed. "I don't know anything about running a business empire." Margaret laughed, a sound like silver bells. "You don't have to. I have excellent lawyers, competent managers, financial advisors who are honest and capable. Your job is just to be my family." "But I am your family," I said, the words feeling strange but right in my mouth. "I've always been your family." "Yes," she whispered, "you have." James cleared his throat. "Margaret, we should probably discuss the legal requirements." She nodded. "There's one condition, Alan. I won't sign the will until you agree to spend time with me. Whatever time I have left, I want to use it getting to know my grandson. I want to hear about your life, your marriage, your daughter. I want to tell you about your mother, about your grandfather, Robert, who would have loved you so much. I want to show you the room I kept for you, the presents I never got to give you." I thought about the shelter, about my cot between Frank and Tommy, about the smell of disinfectant and desperation. Then I thought about Tara, who had called me a burden, and Kevin, who had looked me in the eye and told me I was worthless. "What if your family doesn't accept me?" I asked. Margaret's expression hardened. "You are my only family. Charles made sure of that when he sent Sarah away and forbade me from having more children. Everyone else can accept it or leave." She reached into a drawer beside her chair and pulled out a thick envelope sealed with wax. "This is my will, Alan. It leaves everything to you, but it's not signed. I won't sign it until you say yes." I stared at the envelope, my hands shaking. "You're really my grandmother." "I really am. And my mother. Loved you so much that she defied her father and chose to give birth to you in a foreign country rather than give you up. She died holding you, Alan. Her last words were about how beautiful you were." The tears came then, harder than they had since Susan's funeral. This woman, this stranger who wasn't a stranger, had given me back my mother, my history, my identity. She had turned me from a burden into a beloved grandson. "I want to know about her," I said through my tears. "I want to know everything." Margaret smiled and reached for my hands. "We'll have time for that. We'll have as much time as God gives us." Outside the tall windows, the sun was setting over a city that looked completely different than it had that morning. I was still Alan Morrison, still a 63-year-old man with a healing heart and a daughter who didn't want him. But I was also Sarah Whitmore's son, Margaret Whitmore's grandson, and the heir to a fortune I couldn't even comprehend. The woman who searched had found me, and I had found the family I never knew I'd lost. 3 days later, I stood in the doorway of a room that had been frozen in time for 63 years. Margaret sat beside me in her wheelchair, her oxygen tank softly hissing, watching my face as I tried to process what I was seeing. The room was in the Whitmore mansion, a sprawling estate in the hills outside the city that I'd driven past countless times without ever knowing it belonged to my family. The mansion itself was overwhelming. 37 rooms, Margaret had told me, with gardens that required a full-time staff of 12. But this room, this one room, made everything else fade into insignificance. It was a child's bedroom, but not like any child's bedroom I'd ever seen. The walls were painted a soft blue, with hand-painted murals of sailing ships and distant shores. A hand-crafted wooden crib sat in one corner, its mobile still hanging above it. Tiny silver stars and moons that caught the afternoon light streaming through tall windows. But what took my breath away were the presents. They covered every surface. Wrapped packages on shelves, toys still in their original boxes, clothes with tags still attached. 63 birthdays, 63 Christmases, a lifetime of gifts waiting for a child who never came home. I couldn't help myself, Margaret said softly. Every year on your birthday, every Christmas, I would buy you something and bring it here. The room started as a nursery, but it grew with you. I walked slowly into the room, my chest tight with emotion that had nothing to do with my healing surgery. On the dresser were toys for every age. A teddy bear with a note that said, "For Alan's first Christmas," building blocks, a bicycle with training wheels, baseball gloves, model airplanes, books for every reading level from picture books to classic literature. "This bicycle," I said, touching the handlebars of a red Schwinn that looked like it had been purchased in the 1970s. "I had one just like it." "I know," Margaret smiled. "Margaret Morrison sent me a photograph of you learning to ride it. I bought this one the next day and pretended it was the same one." I picked up a wrapped present from the nearest shelf. The tag read, "Happy 16th birthday, Alan," in Margaret's careful handwriting. "Open it," she said. Inside was a set of car keys and a savings bond for $5,000 to buy my first car. "You bought me a car for my 16th birthday?" "Well, money for a car. I didn't know what kind you'd want." Her voice was wistful. "I imagined we'd go shopping together, that I'd teach you to drive in the estate's circular driveway like I did with Sarah." I set the gift down carefully and continued exploring the room. There were clothes in every size, from infant onesies to adult suits, photo albums filled with pictures of places Margaret thought I might like to visit, college brochures from universities she'd hoped I might attend. "This must have cost a fortune," I said. "What good is a fortune if you can't spend it on the people you love?" In the corner sat a rocking chair with a stack of letters tied with a blue ribbon. Margaret noticed me looking at them and wheeled over to pick them up. "I wrote you letters," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every week for the first 10 years, then monthly after that. Letters telling you about your mother, about your family history, about my hopes for your future." She untied the ribbon with shaking hands and pulled out the top letter. "This one was written when you were 5 years old." The envelope was yellowed with age, addressed to "My dearest grandson Alan" in Margaret's elegant script. Inside, the letter was written in fountain pen ink that had faded to a soft brown. "My dearest Alan," she read aloud, "today I went to the park and watched children playing on the swings. I wondered if you like swings, if you laugh when you go high, if you've learned to pump your legs by yourself yet. Your mother loved swings when she was little. She would beg me to push her higher and higher until I was afraid she might fly away." Margaret's voice broke, and she had to stop reading. I sat down on the edge of the bed, a twin bed that had been replaced multiple times as I'd grown, she explained, and listened as she continued. "I bought you a baseball glove today, even though I don't know if you like baseball. Robert played baseball in high school, and Sarah loved watching the games on television. I hope someone is teaching you to throw a ball, to catch it, to love the game the way your grandfather did." She looked up at me. "Did you play baseball?" "Little league until I was 12, I said, my throat tight. "I played first base." Margaret smiled through her tears. "Robert played first base, too." She handed me the stack of letters. There are over 2,000 of them. Every important moment I could think of, every family story I wanted to share with you, every grandmother's worry and hope and dream. I held the letters like they might dissolve in my hands. 2,000 letters to a grandson she'd never met, a lifetime of one-sided conversations with a child she'd lost before she ever had the chance to know him. "Margaret," I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." She nodded. "Why now? I've been Alan Morrison for 63 years. I've had a whole life, a family, a career. Why is it so important to leave me all of this? You don't really know me." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving around the room that represented 63 years of love and longing. "Do you know what it's like?" she said finally. "To go to bed every night wondering if the person you love most in the world is safe? To wake up every morning knowing that somewhere out there is your family and you don't even know if they're alive or dead?" I thought about the nights I'd lain awake after Susan died, worrying about Tara, wondering if she was happy, if I'd raised her right. "I hired private investigators," Margaret continued. "I always knew where you were, generally speaking. I knew when you got married, when Tara was born, when Linda died. I knew about your struggles after Susan passed away, about your health problems, about your financial situation. You were watching me. I was loving you from a distance." Her voice was firm. "I knew you sold your house to pay for your surgery. I knew Tara refused to let you stay with her while you recovered. I know about the shelter." The words hit me like a slap. "You knew about the shelter?" "James called me the morning after you were admitted. My investigators had been monitoring your medical records, hoping for exactly this opportunity. When your surgery was entered into the Whitmore medical database, it triggered an alert." I felt a surge of something between anger and embarrassment. "So this whole thing, finding me at the shelter, the dramatic rescue, that was all planned?" "No," Margaret said quickly. "Finding you was planned. The rescue was real. Alan, do you think I wanted my grandson to spend a single night in that place? Do you think I wouldn't move heaven and earth to bring you home the moment I knew where you were?" I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the manicured gardens. A fountain sparkled in the center of the main courtyard, and peacocks wandered across perfectly maintained lawns. It was beautiful, peaceful, and completely foreign to anything I'd ever known. "This isn't my world," I said. "It should have been." "But it wasn't. I'm a construction worker from the wrong side of town. I don't know anything about managing hundreds of millions of dollars or living in a mansion or whatever it is that people like you do." Margaret wheeled her chair over to where I stood. "People like us," she corrected gently. "This is your birthright, Alan. Charles Whitmore stole it from you when he sent Sarah away, but that doesn't mean it stops being yours." She pulled a folder from her lap and opened it on the windowsill. Inside were financial statements, property deeds, investment portfolios, page after page of numbers that made my head spin. "Whitmore Enterprises owns 17 commercial properties, including 3 shopping centers and the building that houses your old construction company," she said. "We have investments in technology companies, medical research, renewable energy. The charitable foundation provides scholarships for children who've lost parents, funds medical research, and supports homeless shelters." I looked at her sharply. "Homeless shelters." "8 of them, including the downtown Mercy shelter where you were staying." Margaret's smile was sad. "I've been supporting Sister Mary Catherine's work for 15 years. She doesn't know about our connection, but I couldn't bear the thought that there might be other grandsons out there, other people like you who needed help." The revelation stunned me. The place that had given me shelter in my darkest hour was supported by the grandmother I didn't know I had. "You see," Margaret said, "you've been part of this family's work all along. You just didn't know it." She turned to another page in the folder. "But Alan, I need you to understand something. This money, this empire, it's not a gift, it's a responsibility. Every business decision affects hundreds of employees. Every investment choice impacts the thousands of people who benefit from our charitable work. When I give this to you, I'm not just giving you wealth. I'm giving you the power to help people the way I've tried to help you." I thought about Frank at the shelter, talking to himself about the grandson who never visited, about Tommy with his factory cough and his lost job, about Marcus, the former accountant who couldn't afford bus fare. "What if I'm not good enough?" I asked. "What if I make the wrong decisions and lose everything?" Margaret reached out and took my hand. "Do you know what your first instinct was when James offered to help you leave the shelter?" I shook my head. "You asked if he was sure he had the right person. You worried that some other Alan Morrison might be in trouble somewhere, might need the help more than you did. That's not the reaction of someone who's going to make selfish decisions with this inheritance." She pulled out one more document, this one older and more worn than the others. "This is a letter Your mother wrote to me 2 days before you were born. She was alone and scared in that Swiss hospital, but listen to what she said. Margaret's voice was soft as she read, "Mother, I know you think I'm too young to understand what I want, but I know exactly what kind of person I want my child to become. I want him to be kind to people who have less than he does. I want him to work hard and appreciate what he has. I want him to know that love is more important than money, even though I hope he never has to choose between them. Most of all, I want him to know that he was wanted, that he was loved, that his life matters not because of what he can do for others, but because of who he is." Margaret folded the letter carefully. "That's the child Sarah wanted you to be, Alan. And from everything I've observed over the past 63 years, that's exactly who you became." I sank back down onto the bed, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. How do I even begin to process this? One day at a time, one decision at a time. Margaret's voice was growing weaker. Our conversation had tired her, but her eyes were bright with determination. "I want to spend whatever time I have left teaching you about the business, introducing you to the key people, making sure you understand your options. But more than that, I want to tell you about your mother, about your grandfather Robert, about the family you never got to know." She paused, studying my face. "But first, I think we need to deal with Tara." My stomach clenched. "What about Tara?" "James tells me she's been calling his office every day since word got out that you've inherited the Whitmore fortune. Apparently she's very concerned about your welfare and wants to make sure you're not being taken advantage of by unscrupulous lawyers." The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. The daughter who'd thrown me out of her house for being a burden was suddenly concerned about my welfare now that I was worth $400 million. She wants to see me? She wants to see your inheritance. Margaret's expression hardened. "I've seen women like your daughter before, Alan. They love you exactly as much as you're useful to them." I thought about Tara as a child, how she'd curl up next to me on the couch to watch television, how proud she'd been when I taught her to tie her shoes. But I also thought about the cold calculation in her eyes when she'd explained why I couldn't stay in her home. "What do you think I should do?" Margaret smiled, and for a moment she looked decades younger. "I think you should let her visit. I think you should listen to what she has to say. And then I think you should make your own decisions about what kind of relationship you want with her going forward. And if she's only interested in the money? Then you'll know exactly where you stand, and you'll make decisions accordingly." Outside, the sun was setting over the estate, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. In this room full of 63 years of love and hope, surrounded by gifts that had been waiting my entire lifetime for someone to open them, I felt something I hadn't felt since before the surgery. I felt like I belonged somewhere. Margaret was watching me with the kind of expression I imagined mothers and grandmothers were supposed to have when they looked at their children. Pride, love, and infinite patience. "There's one more thing," she said, reaching into her handbag and pulling out a small velvet box. "This was your grandfather Robert's. He died when Sarah was 15, long before you were born. But he always said it would go to his grandson someday." Inside the box was a gold pocket watch, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling. When I opened it, I could see an inscription on the inside cover, "To Robert Whitmore, Jr., from his loving father. May you always have time for the things that matter most." Robert Jr. was supposed to be your father's name, Margaret explained. If Sarah had lived, if she'd been able to marry David Morrison, their son would have been Robert Morrison, but you're still his grandson, Alan. You're still the boy this watch was meant for. I held the watch in my palm, feeling its weight, its history, its promise of continuity across generations. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just Alan Morrison, the construction worker from nowhere. I was Robert Whitmore's grandson, Sarah Whitmore's son, Margaret Whitmore's heir. I was family. And tomorrow, I would find out if Tara wanted to be family too, or if she just wanted to be rich. Tara arrived at the Whitmore estate exactly 48 hours after James Richardson's office confirmed the inheritance. She drove through the main gates in her silver sedan, past the manicured gardens and the fountain where peacocks wandered like living jewels, and I watched her from the library window as she sat in her car for a full 5 minutes, staring up at the mansion that was now my home. When she finally got out of the car, she was wearing a black dress I'd never seen before. Expensive, conservative, the kind of outfit someone wears when they want to look respectful and grief-stricken. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she'd forgone her usual heavy makeup for a more subdued look. She was playing a part, and even from a distance, I could see her rehearsing her lines. Margaret had insisted on meeting Tara despite her declining health. "I want to see for myself," she'd said from her wheelchair, where she now spent most of her time with oxygen tubes in her nose and a nurse hovering nearby. "I want to understand what kind of woman could abandon her father after heart surgery." James met Tara at the front door and escorted her to the main drawing room where Margaret and I were waiting. The room was formal and intimidating, with oil paintings of Whitmore ancestors looking down from the walls and furniture that belonged in a museum. I'd chosen it deliberately, wanting Tara to feel the weight of the family history she'd never been part of. When Tara walked in, her eyes swept the room quickly, cataloging everything valuable before landing on me. For a split second, I saw her genuine shock at how different I looked. Gone were the cheap clothes and the defeated posture of the man she'd thrown out of her house. I was wearing a tailored suit that James had helped me select, and my hair had been professionally cut. More importantly, I was sitting upright in a chair that probably cost more than her monthly mortgage payment, no longer the burden she'd discarded. "Dad," she said, her voice carefully modulated to sound relieved and emotional. She approached me with her arms extended, as if she intended to embrace me, but I remained seated and didn't move to meet her halfway. "Tara," I said evenly, "thank you for coming." The awkwardness of the moment stretched between us as she realized I wasn't going to stand up and welcome her with the desperate gratitude she'd probably expected. She settled for placing her hand on my shoulder briefly, then stepped back and turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, her voice respectfully quiet, "I'm so sorry for your loss. For your illness. She stumbled over the words, clearly unsure how to address a dying woman who was giving away $400 million to her father. "Sit down, child," Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been giving orders for 9 decades. "We have much to discuss." Tara perched on the edge of an antique chair, her posture perfect, her hands folded in her lap like a schoolgirl called to the principal's office. I could see her mind working, calculating how to approach this situation, how to position herself advantageously. "I have to say," Tara began, her voice gaining confidence, "I'm so grateful that Dad found family after Mom died, and then Susan, he's been so alone. This is like a miracle." Margaret's eyes were sharp as she studied my daughter. "Is that how you saw him? As alone?" "Well, yes, he had me and Kevin, of course, but we couldn't be everything to him. We have our own lives, our own responsibilities. It must have been so hard for him, especially after the surgery." "Tell me about the surgery," Margaret said, her tone deceptively gentle. Tara glanced at me, then back at Margaret. "It was very scary. Dad was so brave, though. He insisted on handling everything himself, paying for it himself. We offered to help, of course, but he's always been so independent. The lies came so smoothly that I almost believed them myself. In her version of events, she was the caring daughter whose offers of help had been nobly refused by her proud father." "And after the surgery," Margaret pressed, "how did you help him during his recovery?" This was where Tara's story would have to get creative, and I could see her mind racing. "Well, we wanted him to stay with us naturally, but our house isn't really set up for someone recovering from major surgery. No downstairs bedroom, the stairs are steep. We thought he'd be more comfortable in his own home." "But he'd sold his home to pay for the surgery," Margaret said quietly. Tara's composure flickered for just a moment. "Yes, that was unfortunate, but Dad made that decision on his own. We suggested alternatives, but he can be very stubborn about accepting help." "So where did you think he would go?" The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Tara's cheeks flushed pink, and she looked at me as if I should somehow rescue her from this conversation. "We were working on that," she said finally. "There are facilities, programs, we were exploring options." Margaret nodded slowly. "I see. And during this exploration of options, where was Alan staying?" "I don't understand." "Where was your father sleeping while you explored these options for him?" The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Tara's hands were clenched in her lap now, her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. "There was a temporary situation," she said, her voice smaller now. "A short-term arrangement." "He was sleeping in a homeless shelter," Margaret said, her voice like ice. "Your father, who had just undergone major heart surgery, was sleeping on a cot in the downtown Mercy shelter because his own daughter told him he was a burden and couldn't stay in her home." Tara's face went white, then red, then white again. It wasn't like that. You don't understand the whole situation. Then explain it to me." For the first time since she'd arrived, Tara looked directly at me, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Fear. Not fear of Margaret or of losing money she'd never had, but fear that her carefully constructed image of herself as a loving daughter was about to be demolished in front of witnesses. "Dad, tell her. Tell her how we offered to help, how you insisted on being independent. Tell her about the conversations we had about the best options for your recovery." I looked at my daughter, this woman I'd raised from childhood, whose diapers I'd changed and whose tears I'd wiped and whose college tuition I'd paid with money I'd borrowed against my future. I thought about Kevin's words, "You are a burden." I thought about the cold dismissal in Tara's voice when she'd explained why I couldn't stay in her house. "Which conversation would you like me to tell her about, Tara? The one where you explained that Kevin's mother might visit and need the guest room? The one where you mentioned the bathroom renovation that somehow prevented me from using any of the 4 bathrooms in your house? Or the one where your husband looked me in the eye and told me I was a burden?" Tara's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Daddy, you're taking that out of context. Kevin was just stressed and you agreed with him," I said quietly. "You stood there and listened to him call your father a burden, and you didn't disagree. You didn't defend me. You didn't say a single word in my favor." "That's not true." "Then what did you say, Tara? When Kevin called me a burden, what did you say in response?" She stared at me, her eyes filling with tears that might have been genuine or might have been calculated. I waited, giving her the chance to tell me what I'd said wrong, to explain how I'd misunderstood the situation. She said nothing. Margaret had been watching this exchange with the focused attention of a prosecutor cross-examining a hostile witness. Now she leaned forward in her wheelchair, her oxygen mask dangling around her neck. "Tell me, Tara," she said, "when did you first learn about Alan's inheritance?" What do you mean?" "It's a simple question. When did you first become aware that your father had inherited money from his biological family?" Tara's lawyer had obviously coached her for this question because her answer came out too quickly and too smoothly. "When Mr. Richardson called to tell me Dad was safe and staying with family, I was so relieved to hear he was okay." "And when was that?" 3 days ago." Margaret nodded to James, who opened a folder and pulled out a sheet of paper. "This is a record of phone calls made to my attorney's office in the past week. Would you like to know how many calls we received from you, Tara?" "I was concerned about my father." 17 calls, James said, reading from the paper. "The first one came 6 hours after the inheritance became public record. That was 4 days ago, not 3. Tara's face flushed again. "I may have the timeline confused. I've been very emotional." "The first call," James continued, "was not to ask about Alan's well-being. According to my notes, you wanted to know if the inheritance was real, how much money was involved, and whether Alan was competent to make his own legal decisions." "I was protecting him." "From what?" Margaret asked. "From people who might take advantage of him. He's never dealt with this kind of money. He's trusting, he's naive about financial matters. I was worried that unscrupulous people might manipulate him." Margaret's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. "Unscrupulous people. Like the daughter who threw him out after surgery? Like the son-in-law who called him a burden? Those kinds of unscrupulous people? Tara stood up abruptly, her composure finally shattering completely. You don't know anything about our family. You don't know what we've been through, what kind of man my father is. He's not some sweet, innocent victim. He's demanding and difficult And what? I asked, standing up as well. For the first time in our entire relationship, I was looking down at my daughter, literally and figuratively. Finish that sentence, Tara. Tell Mrs. Whitmore what kind of man I am. She stared at me, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her carefully applied makeup now smeared with tears. You're selfish, she said, her voice breaking. You've always been selfish. Everything always has to be about you, your needs, your problems, your health issues. Do you know what it was like growing up with a father who was always struggling, always worried about money, always making me feel guilty for wanting nice things? The words poured out of her like poison from a lanced wound. You never remarried after Mom died because you said you wanted to focus on me, but really it was because you were afraid of being hurt again. You made me responsible for your happiness, and then you married Susan and acted like I should be grateful to have a stepmother I barely knew. Tara. And then when Susan got sick, you expected me to help take care of her like she was my real mother. You guilt-tripped me into visiting, into helping with doctor's appointments, into pretending I cared about a woman who was just some stranger you'd married. Margaret was watching this outburst with the clinical interest of someone who'd seen a lot of human nature in her 99 years. I felt like I was seeing my daughter clearly for the first time, and what I saw was a stranger. And now, Tara continued, her voice rising to almost a shout, now you've somehow stumbled into this fairy tale fortune, and everyone's acting like you deserve it, like you're some kind of hero. But you're not. You're just a lonely old man who was too proud to accept help from his own family. The room fell silent except for the sound of Tara's ragged breathing and the soft hiss of Margaret's oxygen tank. Outside, I could hear the fountain running and the distant sound of the gardener's equipment. Are you finished? I asked quietly. Tara wiped her eyes, smearing her mascara further. No, I'm not finished. I want to know what your plan is. Are you going to cut me out completely? Are you going to punish me for being honest about what kind of father you really were? I looked at this woman who shared my genes and my name, but who had just revealed that she shared none of my values. I'm not going to punish you, Tara. I'm going to give you exactly what you think I'm worth. She blinked, confused. What does that mean? I turned to James. Can you arrange for a trust fund to be established for my daughter? $50,000 should be sufficient. 50,000? Tara's voice was incredulous. Out of 400 million, you're leaving me $50,000? It's more than Kevin thought I was worth, I said. He called me a burden. I'm assuming he meant I was worthless, so $50,000 is actually quite generous under the circumstances. Margaret was smiling now, an expression of pure satisfaction. I think that's very fair, Alan. Tara looked back and forth between us, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to process what was happening. You can't be serious. I'm your daughter, your only child. Yes, I said. You are. And you've made it very clear that you consider that relationship to be a burden rather than a blessing. I sat back down, feeling calmer than I had in weeks. The $50,000 will be released to you when you turn 40. That gives you 9 years to think about whether you want to repair our relationship or whether you prefer to consider me selfish and demanding. Your choice. Tara stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her mind working, calculating whether there was still a way to salvage this situation. Finally, she tried one last approach. Daddy, she said, her voice soft and pleading, the way it had been when she was a little girl asking for a toy or a later bedtime. I'm sorry, I didn't mean those things. I was just scared and emotional. You know I love you. I looked at her face, searching for some sign of genuine remorse, some indication that her apology was real rather than strategic. But all I saw was calculation, the same cold assessment I'd seen in Kevin's eyes when he'd evaluated my worth as a house guest. I know you love me, Tara, I said finally. You love me exactly as much as I'm useful to you. The problem is, I don't think that's actually love. She stood there for another moment, tears streaming down her face, waiting for me to change my mind, to soften, to be the pushover father who'd given her everything she'd ever wanted. When it became clear that wasn't going to happen, something in her face hardened. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice cold again. "You'll die alone and miserable, and all your money won't change that." She gathered her purse and walked toward the door, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. At the threshold, she turned back one last time. "I hope your new family makes you happy, Dad, because you just lost your real one." The door closed behind her with a soft click, and the three of us sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Margaret reached over and took my hand. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know that was painful." "It was necessary," I replied. "I needed to see who she really was. I needed to know if she loved me or just needed me. And now you know. Now I know." I squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you for giving me the strength to stand up to her." Margaret smiled. "You've always had that strength, Alan. You just needed to know you had choices." Outside, I could hear Tara's car starting, the engine revving angrily before she drove away from the estate and out of my life. For the first time since my surgery, I felt like I could breathe deeply without pain. I was no longer anybody's burden. Margaret died on a Tuesday morning in November, 3 weeks after Tara's visit, with her hand in mine and sunlight streaming through the tall windows of her bedroom. She had lived to be 99 years old, and in our final weeks together, she'd given me something more valuable than all the money in the Whitmore accounts. She'd given me the knowledge that I was loved unconditionally, that I belonged somewhere, that my life had meaning beyond what I could provide to other people. Her last words were about Sarah, my mother. "Tell her," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the soft hiss of the oxygen machine. "Tell her that her son turned out exactly the way she hoped he would." I held her hand until it grew cold, and then I sat with her for another hour, looking out at the gardens where peacocks wandered among flowers that would bloom again in the spring. The nurse had offered to call the funeral director immediately, but I wasn't ready to let her go. For 63 years, I'd been Alan Morrison, a man without a history. For 3 precious weeks, I'd been Alan Whitmore Morrison, a beloved grandson with a family legacy that stretched back generations. The funeral was held at St. Catherine's Cathedral, the same church where Margaret had been married 78 years earlier, where she'd buried 2 husbands and a daughter, where she'd prayed every week for 6 decades that she would see her grandson again before she died. The cathedral was filled with people I'd never met. Business associates, charitable foundation board members, employees whose livelihoods depended on Whitmore Enterprises. But they weren't strangers. They were part of Margaret's extended family, and now they were part of mine. Sister Mary Catherine from the downtown Mercy Shelter sat in the 3rd pew, her small frame almost lost among the wealthy and powerful mourners. When she'd learned about my connection to Margaret, she'd wept with joy rather than surprise. "I always wondered why Mrs. Whitmore was so passionate about our work with abandoned seniors," she told me after the service. "Now I understand. She wasn't just funding our mission, she was healing her own heart." James Richardson handled the reading of the will, though there were no surprises. Margaret had kept her word. Everything. The $400 million, the real estate empire, the charitable foundations, the mansion, even the room full of 63 years of birthday presents belonged to me now. But the money wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was the letter Margaret had left me, written in her careful handwriting just days before she died. "My dearest Alan, you came into my life when I had given up hope that God still had miracles in store for me. In 3 weeks, you gave me more joy than I'd experienced in 3 decades. You listened to my stories about your mother as if they were precious gifts. You held my hand when I was scared. You made me feel like someone's grandmother instead of just a dying old woman with too much money and not enough family. But more than that, you showed me that Sarah's son had grown into exactly the man she would have wanted him to be. Kind, strong, generous, and wise enough to know that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the love we give and receive. The money and the businesses are yours now, but they come with a responsibility. Use them to help people the way I tried to help you. Remember that every homeless shelter we support might be housing someone's lost grandson. Every scholarship we provide might be going to someone's abandoned daughter. Every meal we serve might be feeding someone who just needs to know that they matter to somebody. You asked me once why it was so important to leave you everything. The answer is simple. Because you're the only family I had left, and because I trust you to carry on what your mother and I started. The work of making sure no one has to face life completely alone. Live well, my dear grandson. Love deeply. And remember that somewhere, your mother is watching and smiling with pride. All my love, Grandmother Margaret, P.S. The Peacocks are particular about their feeding schedule. James will explain. I read that letter sitting in the library where I'd first met Tara as an heiress rather than a burden, and I made a decision that would have surprised the man I'd been just a month earlier. I wasn't going to keep the fortune for myself. I was going to use it exactly the way Margaret intended, to make sure no one else had to spend their life feeling worthless and abandoned. The first thing I did was establish the Sarah Whitmore Foundation for Abandoned Seniors, dedicated to providing housing, medical care, and emotional support for elderly people whose families had discarded them. The foundation's first facility was built on the grounds of the Whitmore estate, in what had been the gardens behind the mansion. It wasn't a nursing home or a charity shelter. It was a community, a place where people like Frank from the homeless shelter could have their own apartments, where people like Marcus could use their skills to help others, where people like Tommy could receive the medical care they needed without feeling like burdens. Sister Mary Catherine agreed to oversee the daily operations, though she insisted on one condition. "No sad faces," she said. "If we're going to do this, we're going to do it with joy. These people have had enough sadness." The second thing I did was something that would have shocked Tara, though she never found out about it. I set up a larger trust fund in her name, not $50,000, but $5 million, with one condition. The money would only be released if she spent 1 year volunteering with abandoned seniors, learning what it felt like to be on the receiving end of compassion rather than judgment. James thought I was being too generous. "She made her choice," he said. "And now I'm making mine," I replied. "I'm choosing to give her the chance to become the person her grandmother Linda would have wanted her to be, and the person her stepmother Susan tried to teach her to be." Whether Tara would ever claim that money remained to be seen, the paperwork was filed, the trust was established, and if she ever wanted to understand what love without conditions looked like, the opportunity would be waiting for her. The third thing I did was honor Margaret's request to maintain Whitmore Enterprises as a thriving business that could fund our charitable work for generations to come. I hired the best financial advisors, kept the most competent managers, and learned everything I could about running a company whose decisions affected hundreds of employees and thousands of beneficiaries. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I felt overwhelmed by the responsibility, when I questioned whether a 63-year-old former construction worker really belonged in boardrooms and investment meetings. But every time I doubted myself, I remembered Margaret's words. "You've been preparing for this your entire life. You just didn't know it." She was right. 4 decades of construction work had taught me about managing teams, meeting deadlines, and building things that would last. Raising Tara alone had taught me about patience, sacrifice, and the importance of setting boundaries. Caring for Linda and then Susan during their illnesses had taught me about grace under pressure and the dignity that comes from serving others without expecting anything in return. Most importantly, sleeping in that homeless shelter had taught me what it felt like to be invisible, to be discarded, to wonder if anyone in the world would care if you disappeared. That experience had given me the motivation to make sure no one else had to feel that way. 1 year after Margaret's death, I stood in the courtyard of the Sarah Whitmore Community Center and watched as Frank, the man who used to talk to himself about his absent grandson, taught a group of children from the local school how to plant tomatoes in the community garden. His grandson had never visited, but Frank had found new purpose in becoming a grandfather figure to children whose own grandparents were too busy or too far away to be involved in their lives. Marcus had been hired as the foundation's financial advisor, his decades of accounting experience invaluable in managing our budget and ensuring that every dollar went to help someone who needed it. His diabetes was well controlled now that he had access to proper medical care, and he walked through the halls with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing your skills are valued. Tommy had moved into one of the community apartments after his factory cough was diagnosed as treatable lung disease. He spent his days in the workshop we'd set up, teaching younger residents practical skills like electrical work and basic repairs. He'd stopped coughing and started laughing, and the transformation was remarkable. Sister Mary Catherine had been right about one thing. There were no sad faces here. The Sarah Whitmore Community Center buzzed with activity, conversation, and the kind of genuine laughter that comes from people who know they're wanted exactly where they are. As I walked through the halls that evening, stopping to chat with residents and volunteers, I thought about Margaret's room full of presents. 63 years of birthday gifts for a grandson she'd never met. I'd finally opened them all, one at a time, savoring each carefully chosen toy, each thoughtful book, each expression of love that had waited decades to be received. Some of the gifts I'd kept. The baseball glove that was exactly like the one I'd learned to play with, the bicycle I'd given to a local child whose family couldn't afford one, the books I now read in the evening in the library that had become my favorite room in the mansion. But most of the presents I'd donated to the community center, to families who needed them, to children whose grandparents couldn't afford to buy them toys. Margaret's 63 years of love had multiplied, spreading outward to touch dozens of lives she'd never even known existed. I still lived in the mansion, but it no longer felt empty or overwhelming. The house was full of activity now, board meetings for the foundation, volunteer training sessions, holiday dinners for residents who had nowhere else to go. It had become what Margaret always intended it to be, a family home. On Christmas Eve, exactly 13 months after Margaret's death, I sat in the chapel we'd built at the community center and listened as Sister Mary Catherine delivered a short service for anyone who wanted to attend. The pews were filled with people who'd been abandoned by their biological families but who'd found something even more precious. A chosen family based on mutual respect, shared values, and unconditional acceptance. After the service, as people chatted and shared cookies that the kitchen staff had prepared, I stepped outside onto the covered porch. Snow was beginning to fall, dusting the gardens with white that sparkled under the Christmas lights we'd strung through the trees. That's when I saw her. Tara stood at the main gate, looking through the iron bars at the scene of warmth and community beyond. She was wearing a heavy coat and scarf, and snowflakes caught in her hair made her look younger. More like the little girl I remembered tucking into bed all those years ago. She saw me watching her and raised her hand in a tentative wave. I walked slowly down the path toward the gate, my breath visible in the cold air. "Hello, Dad," she said when I was close enough to hear her. "Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, Tara. What brings you here?" She looked past me at the community center, where warm light spilled from the windows and the sound of laughter echoed across the snow-covered grounds. "I've been reading about this place," she said. "About the foundation, about what you've built here. I wanted to see it for myself." I studied her face, looking for signs of calculation or manipulation, but all I saw was curiosity, and something that might have been regret. "What do you think?" I asked. "I think," she said carefully, "that I'm beginning to understand why you were never satisfied with the way Kevin and I lived our lives." She paused, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "I also think I owe you an apology, not because I want something from you, but because you deserved better from me. You deserved better than a daughter who saw you as a burden instead of recognizing you as someone who'd spent his entire life carrying other people's burdens without complaint." I felt something in my chest loosen, a knot of pain I'd carried since the day she'd thrown me out of her house. "Are you here because of the trust fund?" I asked. "Because James told you about the conditions?" She shook her head. "I'm here because I've spent the last year volunteering at a senior center downtown, trying to understand what it feels like to be useful instead of just entitled. and I'm here because I realize that the daughter you raised died somewhere along the way, and I want to know if it's possible to bring her back." I looked at this woman who'd broken my heart and abandoned me when I needed her most, and I saw something I hadn't seen since she was a child: genuine vulnerability. "The gate's not locked," I said. She hesitated. "Are you sure? I know I don't have the right to just show up here and expect forgiveness." "You don't," I agreed, "but you have the right to try to earn it." Tara opened the gate and stepped onto the grounds of the community her father had built, with love instead of money. As we walked back toward the center together, she asked questions about the foundation, about the residents, about how I'd learned to manage such a complex operation. "It's not that complicated," I told her. "You just have to remember that every decision affects real people and every person matters." "Even people who make terrible mistakes?" she asked. I stopped walking and turned to look at her. "Especially people who make terrible mistakes, if they're genuinely sorry and willing to do the work to make things right." We didn't hug. We didn't declare our love for each other or promise that everything would be perfect from now on. But we walked into the warmth and light of the community center together, and for the first time in over a year, I felt like I might have a daughter again. Later that night, as I sat in Margaret's library reading one of the books she'd bought for my 8th birthday, I thought about the journey that had brought me from a homeless shelter to this mansion full of purpose and love. I thought about the woman who'd searched for me across 6 decades, about the mother I'd never known who'd died bringing me into the world, about the grandfather whose pocket watch I now carried and whose values I tried to honor. Most of all, I thought about the difference between being someone's burden and being someone's blessing. For most of my life, I'd tried so hard not to be a burden that I'd forgotten I could be a blessing instead. Margaret had taught me that love isn't about what you can provide to someone else. It's about recognizing the inherent value in every human being. She'd loved me before she knew what kind of man I was, before she knew whether I'd be worthy of her fortune, before she knew if I'd even want to know her. She'd loved me simply because I was her grandson, because I was Sarah's son, because I was family. And now, surrounded by a community of people who'd been discarded and forgotten but who'd found their way to belonging again, I understood what true wealth really meant. It wasn't the $400 million in the bank accounts. It wasn't the mansion or the businesses or the real estate empire. It was this: being someone who mattered to people who mattered to you, being part of something larger than yourself, knowing that your life had made other lives better. I was no longer Alan Morrison, the burden nobody wanted. I was Alan Whitmore Morrison, the man who'd learned that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money. It's the knowledge that you are loved, that you belong, and that you have the power to make sure no one else has to face life alone. Margaret had given me back my family, and now I would spend the rest of my life giving family back to others.